So Simon, if you would introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your background.
Okay, well, my name's Simon Mattsson, and I'm I like to call myself a mixed farmer these days, from Mackay in North Queensland, so on the east coast of Australia, about halfway between Brisbane and Cairns. And sugarcane is my primary production crop. However, I do grow a number of other grain crops, and then also a multi-species cover crop that I then graze with cattle. So that's my production in a nutshell, basically.
Perfect. And you are also a Nuffield Australia Scholar. So would you tell us a little bit about your journey to becoming a Nuffield Scholar and when you did your scholarship, and maybe just touch on your scholar report, if you would.
Okay, well, I was just a sugarcane farmer, if I look back 10 years ago, and very much focused on a conventional production model, using high rates of synthetics and achieving reasonable production. However, our industry had at that stage just completed a long-running yield decline joint venture with a number of partners, and had identified that sugarcane yield right up and down the east coast was in decline. Basically, they couldn't work out exactly why, but they certainly could see that was in decline, and the Mackay district was a classic example of that. 25 years ago, average production across the district was around the mid 90 tonne to the hectare range, and 25 years later it's in the mid 70s. So we've lost 20 tonne to the hectare, and haven't really been able to explain why. So that yield decline joint venture did come up with some findings that you would expect. So out of that, the recommendations were things like control traffic to try and reduce wheel tracking in the field, the use of leguminous cover crops in the fallow period, those were probably the primary two. At that stage, I'd already been doing those recommendations for some time. So for me, that wasn't enough. I was still looking for more answers, and that led to a realisation that biology plays a key role in soil health, and that led to my Nuffield scholarship, which was all about biology, focusing on biology and how that can improve a soil, and out of that, improve production. So making the most of your biological potential is the title of my Nuffield report. And I travelled to, that was 2014, and travelled to a dozen different countries, spread across the globe, looking for answers when it came to biology and in agriculture, and talked to many people, not only scientists but also a lot of practicing farmers that were already well and truly down the road of what's commonly called these days regenerative agriculture. Because by and large, a lot of our soils are recognised as being in decline. And so we can't just be sustainable anymore. We have to regenerate that soil resource. We've got to get it back to what it was. And what it was, I mean, pre-industrial revolution. So it's really been probably since the end of World War I that agricultural soils, at least in the first world, have been in decline, and that has a lot to do with the mechanisation of agriculture. So machinery's just got bigger and bigger, and that's caused a lot of compaction, which is a primary underlying problem for soil in my part of the world, and a lack of organic carbon in the soil, and that's primarily a function of heavy tillage and the use of synthetic fertilisers, in particular nitrogen, synthetic nitrogen. So along that road, I discovered a number of outstanding individuals that were well and truly committed to improving their biological function. So I guess I was inspired by that, and I've come home and tried to extend that inspiration to my peers, and certainly it's gaining traction now, even in the sugar industry in North Queensland with SRA, our sugar research organisation. That's the overarching research organisation for the sugar industry, now taking on board what I've been trying to promote for many years, and that is the need for plant diversity. So the need for crop rotation is widely recognised in industries such as the grains industry, but realistically in sugarcane we had no crop rotation apart from a leguminous fallow once every 5 or 6 years. That was about it. So yeah, we needed much more crop rotation, but I thought we even needed to go further than that. So that's what led into the multi-species cover crops in the fallow, and also the grazing. And then as well as that, there's opportunity to what's commonly called intercrop, because sugarcane is relatively slow to grow in the first 4 months after harvest or after planting. There's a big window there when we can really gain some photosynthetic potential. So this is a key, I think, that agriculture needs to take on board, and we've been very good in Australia and in a lot of first world countries at talking about water use efficiency when it comes to agriculture. But something that we really need to focus on that we have not is sunlight use efficiency. So all farmers get sunlight for free, and yet we have not made the best of that. And a classic example is fallow. So fallowing land is a common practice across the globe, and quite frequently that fallow land is bare. Well, there's nothing worse for biological function than bare soil. Absolutely nothing. So how can we change the intent of farmers from that practice of bare fallowing to intending to have a covered fallow? And I think that'd be the single most important first step that agriculture could take in the 21st century to not only to improve production outcomes, but it'll vastly improve environmental outcomes, and it will go a long way to helping with things like social license to farm, because there's nothing worse than people that have a small amount of knowledge at least, seeing dirty brown water running off fields during a heavy rainfall event. If there's one way we're going to get ourselves in trouble, that's it right there. Apart from the obvious, like Australia's having a lot of problems at the moment with various protesters protesting against animal or for animal rights. So yes, that's Nuffield for me. It's been an amazing experience, and I've enjoyed every moment of it, and it's certainly helping me with my production agriculture and encouraging me to spread that message of how agriculture can improve outcomes.
Excellent. And I think, Simon, one of the things that's really neat is you did your actual Nuffield travels in 2014, but fast forward a bit, and in 2019 you had the chance to go to a United Nations event in Nairobi to not just represent Nuffield, to be there as a Nuffield scholar, but to be there in your own right to add to the conversation. And would you talk a little bit about what the event was that took you to Nairobi in March?
Well, like most of agriculture, I guess I was almost totally unaware of what the United Nations Environmental Assembly actually was. And for me, it was basically a phone call from Jim Gelch, or an email rather, to ask the question as to whether or not I'd be interested in going. And I couldn't turn that down. Realistically, it's such an opportunity to have a new experience, and I had very little idea of what I was going to, but I knew it would be enlightening, put it that way.
Yeah.
So I was keen to go.
Okay. I think for many of us in the Nuffield program, so many amazing opportunities start with a phone call from the organization's CEO, Jim Gelch. So I completely understand that. So the United Nations Environmental Assembly is sort of an offshoot of the United Nations, and it looks at environmental issues globally. And certainly agriculture is a big player in that. Sometimes maybe an underrepresented voice, but I think there's no doubt that we impact and are impacted by the actions of the UNEA group, which is that United Nations Environmental Assembly. You went to the 4th meeting, so it's referred to as UNEA 4. Can you talk a little bit about what you found most surprising as a part of that UNEA 4 event?
Well, the first couple of days, it was very, very confusing. And then the picture started to evolve from there. And without doubt, the most surprising point for me was the lack of representation, particularly of production agriculture from across the globe. So when you consider that agriculture is performed on roughly 50% of the planet, you would expect at United Nations level then, particularly the Environmental Forum, that there would be a fair representation of agriculture in that space. Mm-hmm. And I was astounded at how little representation there was from agriculture. And realistically, that's one of the reasons why I think Australian farmers quite frequently get lumped with stuff that they really don't know where it came from. When I say stuff, I mean policy. So at UN level, the Australian government is actually signing resolutions to do with the environment primarily, but those resolutions obviously carry over into agriculture. A lot of them have as much to do with agriculture as they do with the environment. Absolutely. So we end up getting legislation years later, and we don't really know where it's come from. Well, this is where it's come from. It's come all the way from the UN level. It's all about the government trying to meet commitments they'd already made some time ago.
Mm-hmm. And I don't think that's unique to Australia either. I think that is something that's increasingly impacting agriculture in a lot of countries. And in a lot of instances, exactly what you said, producers don't know where it's coming from and don't realize these conversations are happening. I know it's been a revelation for me how pervasive these conversations are, how big they are, and how impactful they are, and the fact that until a year ago, I really didn't know much about them at all. So the lack of agricultural engagement, the lack of producer voice surprised you. Was there anything at UNEA 4 that inspired you? And maybe it's the same thing, but what is it that you carried away with you that inspired you to take some action?
Well, I did say that there was a lack of production agriculture that I was astounded at. Well, actually, there is a very large representation of Indigenous agriculture at UNEA 4 that I really didn't expect to see. So when you talk about countries, a lot of countries in Africa, through Asia, most of the agriculture is still being performed by Indigenous groups. Mm-hmm. And a classic example is Mongolia. So Mongolia actually had a fair representation, probably a much larger representation at UNEA 4 than Australia did. Mm-hmm. And they were there to promote the year of the pastoralist, which I think they're aiming at having next year.
Okay.
Primarily because Mongolia, when it comes to agriculture, grazing systems, mostly cattle and goats, dominate the landscape. So for them, agriculture is a much bigger player in their economy than it is even here in Australia. And they were quite a force at UNEA compared to Australia. So if Indigenous groups can pull themselves together with obviously a a much greater lack of funding than what production agriculture, particularly in this country, has at its disposal, then why can't we?
Mm-hmm.
So certainly in the level of representation for Indigenous agricultural groups was something that certainly inspired me at UNEA. They really are taking a much more proactive stance at that level than we are.
Mm-hmm. So and hearing that and how that inspired you, how do you think you'll take action now that you've been to UNEA 4, you've been to this event, you understand a little bit more the ripple effect of it? What will you do now as an outcome of it?
Well, the first thing was to write that report.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, I think I've portrayed in that report just how small the representation was and what the potential is.
Mm-hmm.
So I actually got the chance to ask the president of UNEA a question, and that's hard enough in itself to be able to get 2 minutes of his time to ask him a question and get a response. I asked him the question of exactly that. Considering agriculture is performed on roughly 50% of the planet, wouldn't you think a United Nations Agricultural Assembly would be a good thing?
Mm-hmm.
And he said it probably would be, but he also said he thought it would be next to impossible, and he referred to what's happening in Europe at the moment with Brexit.
Yeah.
But he didn't dismiss it.
Yeah.
So what I'm proposing is that the UN actually has an agricultural assembly in the week leading into the environmental assembly.
Mm-hmm.
Because another point that he made was expense.
Yeah.
So UNEA 4 or any UNEA event is extremely expensive for all of those participants, without doubt. So we don't want to blow that expense budget clean out the water. But if agriculture could pull itself together in the week prior to UNEA to have an agricultural assembly, and then send key members of that to the environmental assembly.
Mm-hmm.
And for instance, the president of the agricultural assembly could be vice president of the United Nations Environmental Assembly, so that then agriculture has an equal footing.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly agriculture needs to do better environmentally, and that's what the environmental movement is using against us, because at that level, at UNEA 4, what I saw when it came to production agriculture, the lack of representation at least, this agriculture was in two groups. There was this group that was quite often promoted as a possible saviour for the planet.
Mm-hmm.
So organic regenerative agriculture, sequestering carbon, and the other group, which was quite often portrayed, particularly by environmentalists, as destroying the planet. So high production agriculture, the high use of synthetics, caged animals, feedlot animals, that style of thing. So you've got these two groups of agriculture that really don't like to talk to each other. Then you get the environmental and the movement in the middle that are painting us all with the same brush. Mm-hmm. And because we're not there to represent ourselves, very, very efficiently painting us.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't do ourselves any favours by allowing that to happen.
Yeah. And I think you make a great point with that. You actually get ahead of my next question, which is, why is it important to have production agriculture represented in these discussions? And I think that really sums it up, is
yes.
When we're not there, we lose our voice, and we give everyone else the opportunity to frame the conversation and to paint our industry in a different light. Robin Anderson, who you got to work with, who runs Emerging Ag, has been phenomenal and has stated, the future belongs to those who turn up. You've got to be there to be part of that conversation. Simon, talk a little bit then about what you think farmers, ranchers, fishers, agri-professionals can do to be engaged and be part of these conversations.
I guess the first thought that popped into my head was Nuffield, and particularly Nuffield scholars, are on various boards of various agricultural enterprises and grower representative groups across the globe. Well, we have several here in Australia. So those groups that represent portions of agriculture, like horticulture or the GRDC. So there's scholars in those positions that are already representing those groups at the national level.
Mm-hmm.
So realistically, it's those people that probably need to be brought up to speed on this and try to get those organisations to send representation to the next Environmental Assembly.
Mm-hmm.
So that we're not only representing individual farmers, but we're then representing groups of farmers. Because it's an expensive process, we can't all go.
Mm-hmm.
So we really need to send those people that are already in representative positions, I think. No, you go.
So I was just going to say, taking that a little bit further, you referenced sort of Nuffield scholars being engaged at the national level. What do you think the future looks like in terms of Nuffield scholars engaging in these events and with organizations like the United Nations?
Because of Nuffield's profile across the globe, we're in the ideal position to really make a big impact at United Nations level. We really are in that position. That profile now has been long running and at the highest levels in a lot of countries. So without doubt, now that Nuffield has been able to get itself accredited at UN level, there is no reason why that we can't be a force to be reckoned with at that level. Mm-hmm. Certainly we have the ability, but more importantly, I think we should. How do you put this? So I'm searching for words here. It's almost beholden of us mm-hmm. to do that, mm-hmm. Because our scholarships as individuals have been paid for by our industry, by the very farmers that we can represent. So if we're going to do anything for our fellow scholars and our fellow farmers right across the globe, yeah. This is where we need to start. This is where the conversations start. And you mentioned that before, sort of thing. This is when it comes to agriculture and the environment, which are interlinked, that you can't separate the two. So because they're so intertwined, we need to get to the top of the tree when it comes to conversations on these topics. And UNEA is the top of the tree.
Yeah. It's I think you put it perfectly. We've got the ability as Nuffield scholars. We've been able to travel and see things that a lot of our peers won't ever be lucky enough to get to experience or to learn from. And one of the things that's always drilled back into us as Nuffield scholars is we also have the responsibility to carry that forward and to share that. And one of the core tenets of the Nuffield program is reciprocity. And that means I don't keep it to myself. I share it with those around me. I'm open with the industry, but I think that the next iteration of that is I'm an advocate for the industry. And that doesn't mean that Nuffield itself has a stance on any of this. It just believes that the 1,700 of us that are around the world have a duty to stand up and talk about and be advocates and voices of the industry. And I think you're exactly right. This is a place where so many of us probably didn't even know these conversations were happening, but I think it's critical now that we step in and be a part of it. And you started that, so thank you. You and Luciano were the first two Nuffield scholars to go be part of this, and you've set the bar very high for the rest of us. So we really appreciate that, and I think we'd welcome your thoughts on the value of this for the individuals who do say, yes, I'm willing to step forward. I'm willing to raise my hand to make that trip. What do you think that they'll carry out of it?
Inspiration. So the Nuffield process is very inspiring in itself, and this is the next level above that. So agriculture, and this is probably another key element. In first world countries like Australia and the United States, agriculture is being performed by fewer and fewer actual individuals. So the disconnect between the people that actually eat the food and the people that grow the food is ever widening. And that's another very key reason why Nuffield needs to be at representing at United Nations level, because there's less and less farmers and more just general people out there. So agriculture needs to tell its story, and there's fewer and fewer people that are there to tell those stories. So the few that are, need to make sure that they have the greatest impact. And to do that, we need to be at the top, at the greatest levels, at the highest levels that we can. And UNEA is where it starts for agriculture. So if we think that we're ever going to have any influence for, not only for individual farmers, but to improve outcomes for food production systems across the globe, we need to be at UNEA level. And that it's as simple as that. If we're not there to have those conversations, then we will get forced to accept what comes out of those conversations at a later date.
Absolutely. I think that's incredibly well said. Thank you so much for your time and your insight on the UNEA forum and on UNEA 4, which you got to attend. And again, broader than a thank you on behalf of the Nuffield organization, just a big thank you from agriculture in general for putting your life on hold and making that trip to go talk about the industry. You're humble in what you did, but you got to facilitate a few sessions. You got to meet with some of the big leaders in the United Nations. You had the chance to help influence some language that was potentially harmful and negative to farmers and production agriculture while you were there. And all of that's in your report, which folks can link to and read. But you really were in that place and had that willingness and ability to lend your voice to say, no, that's not reflective of agriculture. Let me help you with that definition and that understanding. And I think it sounds cliched, but there are generations of people that are going to benefit from the conversations that you had there. And it's incredible to think that, if not for Nuffield, we wouldn't be able to do any of that. So thank you for your willingness and for your insight. It's much appreciated.
And it's my pleasure entirely, because without Nuffield, my life would be a lot different. So it's been an extremely enriching process for me. I look back on that moment of being awarded the Nuffield Scholarship, and I can put that down as probably the biggest turning point in my life. So yeah, thanks to Nuffield.
Yeah, agree. Well said, and thank you.